Quill Kukla is professor of philosophy and senior research scholar in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics here at Georgetown. This academic year, they are a Humboldt research scholar at Leibniz Universität Hanover in Berlin, though they're zooming in today from DC. They're also currently completing a master's in urban planning at Georgetown, and in their spare time, boxing and powerlifting. Much of Quill's recent and current work explores how embodied selves are shaped by and shape the material spaces they inhabit and use. In City Living, they offer the first systematic philosophical investigation of the nature of city life and city dwellers. Like Quill and the city dwellers they chronicle, the book is fast-moving and inquisitive, covering vast swaths of intellectual ground, but also lingering on beautifully captured bits of life in Johannesburg, Berlin, and DC. We're so excited to hear more of it. Quill?
Thank you so much, Libbie, and thanks to everybody for being here. This is such a beautiful event. Because I'm in DC and because this is a disability studies event, I figured I'd read two short pieces from the book, one set in DC and one about disability. So I'll go ahead and do that. The Civic Plaza at 14th and Kenyon Streets, constructed in 2009 at the same time as the DC USA complex, is the geographical and lived center of Columbia Heights, DC, and also one of its most interesting contested territories. There are ways in which the Civic Plaza is a triumph of urban planning. It's round with benches all around and fountains in the middle. It's surrounded by businesses that are especially inclusive in their appeal, many offering cheap, fun food like frozen yogurt, fried chicken, and pizza. These are treats that almost all families can enjoy and afford, and they're not especially marked by race or class. The arrangement of the benches and the activity in the center mean that out of architectural necessity, those sitting in the plaza are in a circle looking at one another. This draws the neighborhood together and allows the plaza to function as a genuine common space. Kids and dogs play in the center and splash in the fountains in summer, which means that parent and dog owners focus their gaze towards the center on their charges. The plaza is occupied by a noisy melange of folks on most days, from families of all sorts eating and playing, to homeless folks asleep on benches, to wealthy white people buying high-end coffee and artisanal goods from booths, to Music Man George, an elderly Black man who cycles around the plaza on a bike done up with electric lights and a boombox playing Motown, to a few grandstanders with megaphones, some shouting in English and some in Spanish. In some ways, this is an idyllic scene of inclusion. However, there is also a story of tensions and territory to be told about the plaza. Homeless men, mostly from Central America, have long congregated on the benches on the south side. Sometimes they're noticeably drunk or high. Often they're just hanging out, eating or sleeping. One or two are clearly struggling with mental illness, but others simply seem poor. It's not surprising that there are a significant number of homeless people in Columbia Heights, given the combination of rising housing costs and fewer empty units, together with the presence of local social services. Newer residents routinely express fear and resentment of these men. At neighborhood meetings and on local discussion boards, there's a great deal of talk about how these men make passersby, especially women, feel unsafe, and how they are making the space less usable for everyone else. This last is an odd claim since there's plenty of room in the plaza. They are making the space less usable only to those who refuse to share space with them. When other people walk by the homeless men, they tend to avert their eyes and move past fast. The men generally do not ask for money, but they sometimes say hello and are generally ignored. That is, they're treated as if they are literally not in the space at all. They are in practice displaced and made invisible by the other users of the space. Until recently, the condo building on the corner of the plaza, Kenyon Square, housed an obnoxious sports bar aimed at the demographic of the building's residents. The development company that owns the building has long been openly hostile to homeless people and has tried to get rid of them. Without obtaining a permit, the company erected a giant steel fence alongside the plaza, on top of what used to be a popular wall to sit and sleep on, and then fought the city for the right to keep it up. The company also regularly turned the sprinklers on, facing out from its property to clear away the homeless people from the benches near the steel fence. The sprinklers were not oriented so as to water the condo property at all. When some of us tried to stop this practice, a resident of the building told me that he didn't want to have to step over homeless people on his way home, and that I'd object to them too if I had to step over them. This comment is among the most perfect examples I've found of the politics of space being lived out at the level of bodily micro-negotiations. I'm not sure how literal the man was being, but whether he was describing his literal bodily practice or his less literal phenomenological experience of moving through the plaza, that turn of phrase was shocking. It would never have occurred to me to step over neighbors of mine who were using the plaza rather than to simply walk around them as one routinely does in urban spaces. Viewing these men as things to be stepped over, as impediments to motion, is sharply different from viewing them as other people in the space who play human roles in the place ballet of the plaza. I'm certain it never occurred to this resident to step over the middle-class white people who often lie in the sun beside the plaza, or the small kids who sit and play in the center of the circle. To step over someone is to enact dehumanization in a powerful way through a small bodily movement. Cindy Katz discusses how homeless people are routinely treated as litter, objects in people's path, rather than as neighbors who are unemployed or underemployed because of changes in the economic structure of the neighborhood. This treatment as an object is literally incarnated in this motion of stepping over. I'm interested in how this contestation of space between the homeless and other users of the plaza has resulted not in a directly hostile conflict or a neat division of the territory, but rather in the plaza in effect comprising two superimposed spaces that function separately. The homeless people do not show up as people for the other users of the plaza, but as objects or as faceless threats. Meanwhile, the homeless people have created their own niche, complete with norms of socializing and interacting and using the space, none of which have much at all to do with the other uses of the plaza going on around them. The plaza has settled into two uneasily crosshatched territories, two different niches with two different sets of norms, supporting two different sets of place ballets. I apologize for my dog. Okay, moving on to the second reading. A fascinating dimension along which bodies are included or excluded in space is pace. Susan Wendell explores pace differences as a socially powerful form of body diversity and pace bias as a pervasive form of ableism. She points out that we're trained to value speed of work and motion, and we treat those who move or produce at a slower pace as less valuable than others rather than as simply temporally different. My recognition of pace bias in myself when I first read Wendell's book was a major revelation to me. While I had tried to interrogate my own racism, sexism, fat phobia, and the like, it had never occurred to me that my own pride in my fast pace and my frustration with those who moved or talked slowly, whether because of biological or cultural differences, were forms of ableist bigotry. But the quality and value of what one does are in no obvious way connected to how fast one does it. It is an internalized piece of insidious capitalist ideology to think that those who are slower paced are less valuable because they're less productive. Wendell focuses on how institutional norms and social attitudes discriminate against the slower pace, but we can translate this set of insights into the spatial domain. City spaces have an entrenched pace. We looked earlier at how places are structured by place ballets, and place ballets have a rhythm to them. This pace, although culturally variable, develops around the built-in assumption that these spaces are for traditional productive bodies and that faster is better. If someone can't keep up with the pace of the space around them, this will put them out of sync with that space and make it less usable for them. This mismatch between the pace of a person and the pace of a space they may negotiate may produce disability, even in someone who wouldn't be disabled in a slower paced space. We can in fact see this regularly in busy city spaces. To some extent, this kind of exclusion is no one's fault. City spaces develop a pace through slow sedimentation, and it's not as though we can plausibly expect everyone to slow down to match the pace of someone slower than the norm. The problem is that a slower pace is not just a difference that causes a spatial mismatch, it is disvalued. City spaces don't just happen to be fast-paced. This fast pace is valued as integral to productivity. Because speed is valued by most users of city spaces, the pace of their place ballets is maximized. As the pace of a space increases, a larger number of people can't keep up and more people end up contextually disabled. Capitalist ideology, materially instantiated in our spatial niches and the bodies that negotiate them, thus produces disability, as well as a built-in lack of interest in accommodating this kind of difference. While people are unlikely to change their own pace, awareness of pace bias can make us more tolerant and flexible in our micro accommodations of the bodies around us that may not fit so smoothly into the space around them, not because they are lesser, but just because their temporality is different. But there's only so much that consciously reflecting on our pace biases is likely to help. It's hard for us not to perceive bodies that are moving slowly or differently, or that are mismatched with the spatial environment, as problems or as in the way. On the one hand, ableism is pervasive and surely shapes our vision. But on the other, our developed habits and competencies within spaces are in fact grounded in our experience of bodies around us moving in particular ways. This means that bodies that push against these ingrained habits will leap out at us as salient and as breaking the lived patterns we expect and count on. For these reasons, I think that we need to focus first on top-down attempts to reshape spaces so as to accommodate more kinds of bodies from the start, rather than just calling for individuals to be more tolerant, although this would be helpful too. It seems to me that it's impossible that all spaces can be designed to accommodate all bodies. For example, some spaces will be fast-paced by their essential nature, the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, perhaps. Some spaces will be too noisy and busy for those with processing challenges. Some spaces will be designed around their visual appearance and will not be meaningful to blind people. It's important to remember that no one will be at home in all parts of the city. Flourishing cities are just too diverse for this. Supporting every city dweller's right to the city does not mean giving everyone access to an agency within every part of the city, but rather making sure as best we can that everyone has this within a wide range of spaces sufficient to support a flourishing urban life. We need to recognize that right now, access to spaces is not just differentiated, but unequal, in the sense that otherwise privileged city dwellers, those who are white, able-bodied, thin, and so on, also have more and better access to a wider range of spaces and more agency within those spaces. We need to be aware of how spatial injustice and more general patterns of inequality mutually support and amplify one another. And we should try to combat that by making spaces more inclusive when and where we can. Spatial justice requires that we work to make sure that everyone with every kind of body be able to participate fully in urban life. In turn, this requires that we think about whom spaces are built by and for, and who they've come to accommodate as they have developed over time. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Quill, for that. So next, and everybody, you're welcome to clap or you know, in any form you want to react. Feel free to use the reactions. Feel free to drop any questions that occurred to you during Quill's reading in the chat. Reynolds is Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Disability Studies at Georgetown University, Senior Research Scholar in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, and Senior Advisor to the Hastings Center. They are the author or editor of 5 books, Life Worth Living among them, that will hit us with a veritable tidal wave of brilliance between this year, 2022, and 2024. They are the founder of the Journal of Philosophy of Disability and co-founder of Oxford Studies in Disability, Ethics, and Society. In The Life Worth Living, Joel investigates the exclusion of disabled people across the history of Western moral philosophy, arguing that this history arises from what they call the ableist conflation of disability with pain and suffering. Through sensitively rendered personal and familial accounts of pain, disability, and care, Joel demonstrates the richness of these lived experiences and argues that they demand more nuanced conceptions of embodiment, community, and indeed a life worth living. Please welcome Joel.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Libbie. And it is such an honor and a joy to be able to present today with 2 of my colleagues whose work I love and who also I love so much as people. So it's really great to be here. I'm going to be reading today from the conclusion of the book. As a bright-eyed 8-year-old in rainy Oregon, few things seemed cooler than Hollywood, California, the land of picture-perfect beaches, fast cars, and blockbuster movies. That summer, my film industry uncle rode his Harley up I-5, through the towering redwoods and into the land of Douglas firs to visit my family. Despite tales of A-list stars and the Sunset Boulevard life, the conversation around our dinner table that hot July night turned to the mundane. My uncle did not wear a helmet. In fact, he refused to. This alarmed my parents, eager to instill in me the idea that helmet wearing was mandatory, no matter what I rode. In response, my uncle did not mince his words. I'd rather be dead than disabled. Silence filled the room. That fateful phrase hung on the air for what seemed like an eternity as Jason, my brother and best friend, sat next to him in his shiny new wheelchair, being fed by my father. My maternal grandparents, in the transitional thickets of age and illness-related disabilities, sat on his other side. My mother, Gail, recently diagnosed with temporomandibular joint disorder, TMJ, fibromyalgia, and other conditions that would quickly lead her to become disabled, she sat across the table as well. I wasn't angry then, but I am now. Not at my uncle, but at that idea. I'd rather be dead than disabled. I soon came to know that many, far too many, hold it without compunction. I learned that the road to death for countless people with disabilities has been paved by that idea and by ones like it across millennia. Even those who might say it and immediately regret it, like my uncle, invoke an assumption about the worth of a life lived with disabilities that is as old as history itself. On his deathbed, Socrates asks, is life worth living with a body that is corrupted and in a bad condition? In no way, replies his friend, Crito. The question of worthy life has always been a question of disability. As my eyes pan slowly across the dinner table to gauge others' reactions, my mind's eye focused on a simple fact. The sheer existence of so many others seemed to prove my uncle wrong. My life, the life of my brother, my grandparents, my mother, and the life of every other disabled person I knew and know suggest the opposite. These lives suggest instead that being disabled is like any other significant facet of human identity. It shapes one's world. As I stated earlier, whether one is shaped for good or bad, and whether one is shaped a lot or a little, depends on a host of factors. However far my arguments in this book and the arguments of other disability studies scholars and activists across the globe go, we are decidedly far from a world in which disability is understood primarily as difference, not disadvantage, as shaping, not severing, and as complex and changing, not uniform and constant. We are far from this world despite more than a half century of disability activism, despite decades of disability studies scholarship spanning every field in the humanities and the social sciences, despite a rapidly growing field of philosophy of disability, despite laws protecting people with disabilities as a historically oppressed minority group, and despite increasing media representations and representatives that more accurately portray the rich complexity of disabled life. More loudly and more forcefully, we need to talk about the worlds that disability creates. We need to talk about ability in terms of access and care and caring systems. Such world creation will only become intelligible once we commit ourselves to questioning what it means to create worlds in the first place, what it means to build societies and communities that are caring, habitable, and sustaining of the worth of people with bodies and minds and abilities and disabilities of all sorts. To this question, the lives of my brother and of my family suggest a simple and powerful answer. The meanings of world creation, disability, and worthy life are entwined by a single thread: care. It is not the abilities or disabilities of a person that ultimately create worlds worth living in. Care and caring systems create worlds worth living in. Caring systems create the webs of relation that make up the meaning and worth of any given ability or disability in the first place. I always wear a helmet now. I, for one, would rather explore the worlds care creates than deny certain worlds worth on the basis of the only one I've happened to know. I would rather work in community with others to make habitable worlds for all. That, perhaps, is a path on the way to caring better, a path I have learned from my brother and family and the beauty of our world. If, as Cornel West brilliantly discerned, justice is love in public, then care is world-making for all. Thank you.
This way. So Joel, I was thinking about the fact that, as you say in the book, Life Worth Living was written mostly between 2014 and 2016. But its publication was delayed until 2022, which is why you have all these books coming out at the same time. So I was thinking about, or I don't know what other reasons, but what are the reasons why they're all coming out at the same time? And I was thinking about how then for each of you, these books are both out of and in time with the broader arc of your intellectual lives. So Quill, you've taken on several new scholarly fields here. Jennifer, you've shifted into a very different genre and focus from your previous work. So I wonder if you could each talk a little bit about this, about how these books both fit and deviate, and about the time of their writing and the time of your reading them right now, however you want to interpret those many questions, which I pile on like a professor, rather than just offering one. So
go in the same order that we spoke, or do you?
Sure, whatever order you guys feel like maybe responding. Maybe,
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Quill.
Well, thanks. It's a lovely question, and I've been trying to think of something pithy to say about it. I will say, well, I want to say two things. One is I want to say this isn't quite what you asked, but I think it's worth pointing out that City Living came out at the end of 2021, and I wrote it mostly during 2018 and 19. And so there's a strange sense in which the pandemic affected the temporality of the book. I did add a discussion of the pandemic in the introduction to the book and a couple references throughout, but basically it was in the weird position of being a book that was written right before the pandemic, and then the pandemic so deeply impacted city living specifically, and how we move through cities specifically, and how our bodies interact with one another and see one another as spaces of risk and safety, which was a huge topic for me in the book. So there's a strange sense in which, even though the book just came out, I feel like it represents a kind of an innocent pre-pandemic moment. So that's worth mentioning. But more to the point of what you asked, just very quickly, I will say that I've always been an extraordinarily self-centered writer, in the sense that I do philosophy about whatever issues feel truly pressing and urgent in my own life. And I've never been able to get outside of my own life when it comes to my philosophical work. So when I was the parent of a new baby, I was writing on pregnancy and early parenthood, and just at every stage of my life, I've written about what's pressing for me. And I came to a moment in my life where I realized that my true love, the thing that was most consistent across my whole life, had been my love of cities, and that I had reached a stage of my life and a stage of security in my professional life where what I really cared about was exploring cities and understanding them and understanding how they work. And traveling and moving through cities and absorbing cities is really just like a primary love for me. So it was what I wrote about. The one thing that I think has been constant through all my writings, even though they seem to be on these very, very different topics, is that I care deeply and in different forms about how we are agents who are fundamentally embodied, planted in space dependent on one another, finite, vulnerable, and dependent on the spaces in which we move. So we have an imperfect, vulnerable, fundamentally social, fundamentally material form of agency. And that has carried through everything I've written, whether I've written about language, whether I've written about parenthood, whether I've written about cities. What I really care about is that vulnerable, imperfect, non-ideal self. And that's really why I care about disability studies as well, because I think disability studies starts from the premise that humans are interdependent and vulnerable and imperfect, and celebrates that and sees that as the beginning of theorizing, rather than seeing disabled people or people who are expressing vulnerability as some sort of exceptions to a norm of full independence and full completeness and so forth. So that's really, I think, a very deep connection between this work and my past works and my engagement with disability studies as a field.
Thank you for that, Quill. So Joel, I mean, you might want to pick up on some of what Quill just said, I think, but also interested in where this fits in your arc and what it's like to read it now.
Yeah, it's honestly quite strange to read it now, because I feel like it captures a snapshot in my life that now was many years ago, and a snapshot that was transformative, but quite different than where I find myself today. So I'll give two concrete examples. My brother, Jason, to whom the book is dedicated, along with my mother, he died during my first year of grad school. And I really was not expecting him to pass away. I had been planning my whole life on the assumption that he'd live, as long as I did, and I would become his primary caretaker once my parents couldn't do that. And it was very jarring. I'm still not quite sure how I finished grad school, but this project in many ways was a kind of initial working through the trauma of losing him and things like survivor's guilt. Though in my case, it took a kind of particular form. It wasn't so much that I felt guilt that I was still alive. I just felt the world was wrong, that this is the wrong timeline, that I should be in a timeline that he is still around. And also at the time, in 2016, I wasn't talking about myself as disabled. It was 2017 that I first started kind of publicly talking about my psychiatric disabilities and or mental health issues, however you want to phrase it. And also, so there's a whole component where so much of the focus of this book is on my brother and my mom and our family, are engaging in disability studies, religious studies, phenomenology, you name it. But I'm kind of in the background in a certain way. And, I try now these days to center more myself as well as family members and whoever I'm kind of talking about. But at that particular time, I really, it was, this book in many ways comes out of a profound sense of loss, that's still very much, that's not something you get over. It's something you live with. But yeah, I read it and I feel like it's 2015 and 2016 again when I read it, which is just an odd, interesting experience to have when you're reading something you wrote. Yeah, I don't know. Time is, especially after COVID, people are like, when did that happen? I'm like, 20 years ago, yesterday? I can't. Everything's so messed up now. But thank you for that very thoughtful question. I had not thought about that before, so I appreciate the provocation, Libbie. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. My second question is about embodiment, which is such a central concept in disability studies, and also a site, not just a concept, right? We're committed to making it a site of practice and community formation. And you all address embodiment in different ways in your work. So I wondered if you could each talk a little bit about how you approach writing about embodiment, and maybe even a little bit about your own embodied experiences as they inform these projects. So I was thinking, Joel, about your writing about pain from your mother's perspective, or a morning in the life of your family from your own. Quill, I feel like your sense of embodied agency is sort of everywhere in this work as you move through cities and other spaces.
So yeah, it's hard to pick one thing to say, because like you said, really embodiment, it forms the centerpiece of my whole work. The work is about what it's like to be embodied in a city. But I guess what I will say is that one thing I think that may make my work a little bit distinctive is that I'm obsessed with small motions and small features of the body, what I call micro negotiations when I write about them. Right? I'm interested in the way that little gestures and the direction of our gaze and the position that we hold our body in is enormously constitutive of how we interact with the world around us and with other people. And so my method is really to obsess over those small motions. I mean, it came out a little bit in the reading I did with this motion of stepping over the homeless person, and just this very small single step packs in this huge set of meanings about dehumanization and hierarchy and power and territory and who owns a neighborhood and who doesn't own a neighborhood, just in that little act of stepping. So when I did my research for the book and my field work for the book, I really focused on this issue of the small. And one thing about that is just method, if I can answer the question just like an academic for a moment, one thing about that is there's no point on doing interviews with people, because if you ask people to talk about their bodies in these ways, so much of that small motion is implicit and unconscious and not something that we can bring into articulation, that like actually interviewing people and asking them, well, how do you use this space? How do you feel in this space? Was not likely to get at that kind of micro level that I was interested in. So much of my method was photographing and videoing, and in some cases where that was inappropriate for consent reasons, literally drawing people's actual use of space. How do they sit on a wall? How do they sit on a bench? Which direction does their head turn? And so I did a lot of documentation I guess over the course of the book, it came to about 18 different spaces across 3 cities, a lot of just documentation of the tiny small ways in which we move our bodies, in which our bodies touch each other or don't touch each other, and so on. And so that kind of like very visually oriented field work is something that I felt like I could really offer to phenomenology, which tends to focus on a much larger scale of experience most of the time. And I think I'll leave it at that.
That's fascinating. Joel, did you want to?
Yeah, so I don't think I'd even be sitting here today, and I certainly wouldn't be in academia if I couldn't write about the body, and if there wasn't such a rich set of resources across the humanities and social sciences to think about embodiment, because I guess in some ways that's actually the topic I'm most, let's say, obsessed with. And one of the reasons I think the question of embodiment is so important for me and visceral is the way that my family system kind of functioned was one that had to take questions of the body, and there I don't mean that in contradistinction to the mind, so we could say body mind, that had to take questions of the body mind of each of the people in our kind of caring system as central, like as a kind of first principle for how we organized our days, and also how we organized our social world and how we thought about politics, and you name it. And I find the historical relegation of the body to a secondary or worse phenomenon in the canonical Western intellectual tradition to be not simply like weird and curious, but backwards in an almost technical sense of, I mean, you could go to Marx for this, right? Marx has this line, I'm slightly modifying the translation in the German ideology, where he says the first fact of human history is the corporeal organization of the human. And Körperische, it's the Körper there, not Leib, which I'm not sure how much weight we should place on that, but that will get way too in the weeds arguing about German. This idea that the ground floor, the entry point, the foundation, the arche in the Greek sense, both the starting point and the kind of ground of something, for all human life is the way in which we find ourselves. And the way in which we find ourselves in the world is as an embodied being, one that is fundamentally shaped by not simply the particularity of what it is to be an organism that requires a wild amount of resources and interdependencies to get through not just a single day, but to get through even a few hours of the day. When you think about everything that we rely upon, from the water we drink each day to our food to the social, you name it, that is ground zero for me theoretically. And what excites me the most about where the philosophy of disability is going, what excites me the most about where disability studies is going, what excites me the most about disability justice advocates like Talila A. Lewis and Dustin J. Gibson, who are doing some of the most radical, in the honorific sense of radical, work that's truly intersectional in Kimberly Crenshaw's original sense, that is trying to think about the body as the site from which we organize and from which we conceive of the social and political order. This is all, I think this is the right path. This is how we start remaking the world, to borrow a term that Olufemi Taiwo uses in his recent Reconsidering Reparations, my brilliant colleague in the philosophy department. This is how we have to start reconceiving of a world in which over the next century, we know what's going to happen. We're going to have mass displacement. We are on track for millions upon millions of people dying due to climate change, and not simply climate change issues, but also because of the way we've set up nation states and questions of borders. Like, we have to hit reset on the most basic principles around which we organize societies. Liberty, equality, and fraternity have failed us. We need care, and we need vulnerability, and we need interdependency as the core principles from which we organize ourselves as inevitably there's no way around being a global unit of some fashion. Anyway, I got way off on various soapboxes there. How did I get on? Yeah, anyway, the world's on fire and we have a very short window to fix it. And I think focusing on how we are actually embodied is the starting point.
This has been just a riveting evening of shared work and conversation. I'm so grateful to have you as colleagues and to look out into this community and see our brilliant students and our other brilliant colleagues and friends and family. So please go out and get the books. And thank you guys so much. It was a great evening and happy end of the semester. Good night, everybody.